a young woman was found dead in her own apartment. At first, detectives thought the case would be easy to solve, but some questions remained unanswered for decades until a shocking twist flipped the whole investigation on its head. In the end, they did uncover the truth, but the outcome was nothing like anyone expected. Angie Dodge was born on December 21st, 1977, in Washington State. She was the youngest in the family and the only girl with 3 older brothers. Her dad was in the military, so the family moved around a lot. For Angie, that meant constantly switching schools and leaving friends behind, which wasn't easy. Still, she did great in school and had a close bond with her brothers. The whole family loved the outdoors and often went camping together, something Angie grew to love early on. Her favorite time of year was Christmas. It came just a few days after her birthday, so the whole family would usually come together, and they'd celebrate both at once. When Angie's dad left the military, the family was finally able to settle down. They moved to Idaho and made a home in a small town called Idaho Falls. Angie enrolled at the local high school and quickly made friends. She was doing well in class too and often helped other students improve their grades. After graduating in 1995, she got a job at a local bookstore. Not long after that, she moved into her very first apartment. Angie had plans to go to the University of Idaho, but she wanted to save up a bit of money first. So she spent some time working, bought herself a car she'd been dreaming about for years, and enjoyed more time with her family and friends. On June 12th, 1996, 18-year-old Angie went to visit her parents. She and her mom had been in a fight recently, but that day, they made up and had a really nice time together before Angie headed back home. The next morning, she was scheduled to work a shift at the bookstore, but she never showed up. Her parents tried calling her but got no answer. That was unlike Angie, who had never missed work before. Eventually, 2 of her coworkers decided to swing by her apartment to make sure everything was okay. They knocked on the door, but no one answered. After waiting a few minutes, they decided to try the handle. And, to their surprise, the door was unlocked. So they stepped inside and started looking around. At first, it seemed like no one was home, but when they peeked into the bedroom, they were met with a horrifying scene. Angie was lying on the floor next to her bed, and there was blood everywhere. The coworkers ran outside and immediately called the police. Officers arrived and began processing the scene, and it was clear, from the start, they were dealing with a brutal murder. Angie's underwear had been pulled down. Her tank top was torn, and there were multiple wounds on her body that looked like stab marks. All signs pointed to a sexual assault, and the medical examiner later confirmed it. They also recovered biological material from the attacker along with bits of skin found under Angie's fingernails, suggesting she fought back. On top of that, crime scene techs found a single male hair at the scene. Everything was sent to the lab for testing, and forensic experts were able to build a DNA profile of an unknown man. But at the time, the FBI didn't yet have a national DNA database. So police had no choice but to manually compare the sample against individual suspects one by one. Detectives spoke with everyone who knew Angie and asked them to submit their DNA samples. She had a pretty big group of friends who often hung out by the local river, one of the few places to relax in their small town. In addition to friends, police also questioned Angie's coworkers and local men with prior offenses. Altogether, they collected over 100 DNA samples, but none of them matched the killer. And despite months of work, they couldn't find a single viable suspect. That was partly because, aside from the DNA, there wasn't much else to go on. Angie had no enemies, got along with just about everyone, and the exact circumstances of her death were still unclear. Medical examiners could only narrow down the time of death to somewhere between late night and early morning. Police also had no idea how the killer got inside. Since there were no signs of forced entry and the door had been unlocked, they came up with two theories. Either Angie left it open for some reason, or she knew this person and let them in herself. They also started to suspect there might have been more than one attacker. Based on the nature of Angie's wounds, investigators believed someone might have held her down while another delivered the fatal blows. Still, all this remained nothing more than guesswork, because police had no real suspects. The investigation dragged on for months, and Angie's family grew increasingly frustrated that the killer was still out there. Over time, they began to question whether detectives were doing enough to solve the case and voiced their concerns publicly. Losing faith in the investigation, Angie's mom took matters into her own hands. She printed thousands of flyers with details about the case and handed them out all over town. The family also offered a $5,000 reward for any information that could help identify the killer. There was no breakthrough, but the pressure from Angie's family, along with growing concern from the community, pushed police to reopen the investigation and start from scratch. Since there were still no new leads, detectives began asking themselves who was most likely to have committed the crime. Out of everyone in Angie's circle, their focus shifted to her close group of friends, people she spent the most time with. They investigated all of them one more time but again came up empty. But not long after, the investigation took a surprising turn. In January of 1997, police got a call from authorities in Nevada. They had just arrested a man named Benjamin for sexually assaulting a woman at knife point. That immediately raised red flags for detectives because Benjamin used to hang out with the same group of friends as Angie. He moved out of state not long after the murder, and the way he attacked his victim was disturbingly similar to what had happened to Angie. Investigators traveled to Nevada to speak with him, but Benjamin denied having anything to do with Angie's murder. In fact, during the interview, he made a strange claim. He said he didn't even know Angie had been raped. That raised a huge red flag. Benjamin had been her friend, and the fact that she was sexually assaulted was public knowledge. It had been reported in the papers and on the local news, so everyone in their town knew it. Still, Benjamin stuck to his story and agreed to provide a DNA sample. When forensic experts compared it to the killer's profile, it wasn't a match. But detectives weren't ready to cross Benjamin off the list. From the very beginning, they'd considered the possibility that more than one person was involved. Maybe Benjamin hadn't assaulted Angie, but what if he helped with the murder? They decided to focus on the same group of friends Angie and Benjamin had been a part of, specifically on one guy Benjamin had mentioned during questioning. His name was Christopher, and according to Benjamin, the two of them had been pretty close. Detectives brought Christopher in for an interview. He denied any involvement in the murder and said he didn't believe Benjamin was guilty either. In fact, he claimed he had no idea who could have done something like this to Angie. But the police weren't convinced. A few days later, they called Christopher back in for a second round of questioning. They kept pressing him about Benjamin, and eventually, Christopher admitted that maybe Benjamin could have had something to do with it. For detectives, this was the break they'd been waiting for. Not just because they finally had something to use against Benjamin, but because Christopher had just changed his story. Still, he kept insisting he had nothing to do with the murder. So the police had no choice but to let him go for now. They scheduled a follow-up interview a few days later, but Christopher never showed up. When officers went to his house, his mother came to the door. She told them her son would get in touch when he felt ready, and that from now on, he'd only speak to them with a lawyer present. To the detectives, it felt like Christopher was dodging them, and maybe even thinking about skipping town. So they made the decision to arrest him based on the fact that he changed his original statement. Once they tracked him down and brought him back in, they began another round of questioning. This time, they ran him through a series of polygraph tests, and the results were all over the place. Nothing came out as clearly truthful, which only deepened their suspicions. Over the course of several sessions, detectives questioned Christopher for more than 60 hours, and eventually, he started to crack. At first, he denied having anything to do with the murder, but now his story changed. He admitted that he had been in Angie's apartment that night. Then, he claimed he wasn't alone. According to Christopher, Benjamin was there too. And while Benjamin stabbed Angie, Christopher said he held her down. He also mentioned a third person, 18-year-old Jeremy, another friend from their group. Police arrested Jeremy, but he swore he was innocent. And DNA testing backed him up. In fact, every bit of biological evidence from the crime scene ruled out all three of the guys Christopher had just named, including Christopher himself. That left investigators with a big problem. The confession didn't match the physical evidence. So they dropped the charges against Benjamin and Jeremy and focused solely on Christopher. Over the next couple of years, prosecutors built their case. And in 1998, Christopher finally went on trial. By then, police had found a witness who claimed she overheard Christopher talking to a friend about the murder. Based on what he said, it sounded like he'd been directly involved. In court, the jury also watched clips from his interrogation, where he described the crime in graphic detail. During his closing statement, Christopher said he wasn't the monster everyone thought he was, and begged the judge for mercy. In the end, the jury found him guilty of being an accessory to Angie's murder, and he was sentenced to at least 30 years in prison. So Christopher went off to serve his sentence. But Angie's family was still left with unanswered questions. If none of the three suspects matched the DNA from the crime scene, then who had assaulted their daughter? And why did the other two walk free? After the trial, Angie's mother kept pressing police for answers. But she never got anything solid. Investigators didn't seem interested in finishing what they'd started. And with each passing year, her family began to lose hope of ever learning the full truth. For nearly 8 years, Angie's mom showed up at the police station almost every single day, begging them to keep the case open. But eventually, she realized they weren't going to do anything. That's when she made a decision. Not to wait on the police, but to launch her own investigation. She started keeping tabs on the two suspects who were still free, hoping to find anything that might point to the truth. She even tracked down local drug dealers, asking if they'd heard anything about Angie's case. One time, she wandered into such a dangerous part of town that someone nearly shot her. This went on until 2009, when she came across an organization that helped people who had been wrongfully convicted. To her surprise, one of the people who had reached out to them was Christopher. She decided to contact the organization herself, something that had never happened before in the state. A victim's family member asking for help from a group trying to free the accused. That's when she learned that Christopher had been claiming his innocence for years. According to him, the police had pressured and manipulated him into confessing. Angie's mom, who'd spent over a decade believing he was guilty, decided to take a closer look. She requested the full recordings of Christopher's interrogations and watched all 60 hours of footage. The video and audio were grainy and hard to make out, but she pushed through, trying to catch every word. And when she finished, she was shocked and furious. Based on the tapes, she realized something devastating. Christopher had nothing to do with her daughter's murder. For most of the interrogation, he denied everything, but the police kept pushing relentlessly until he started repeating what they wanted to hear. Based on the footage, he had no idea what they were even asking. The detectives were feeding him details one after another. He didn't know Angie's address, so they told him. He said the murder happened in the living room. They corrected him, said it was the bedroom. and he just went along with it. Angie's mother was stunned. She now believed the detectives had pushed this young man to the brink until he would have confessed to anything. So she reached out to his new lawyer, who had been working to get the case reopened, and together they started searching for the truth. Over the next few years, they teamed up with another organization that helped innocent people get their convictions overturned, and they began building a case for appeal. Along the way, Christopher's lawyer tracked down the so-called witness who had testified that she overheard him confess to the murder. But when she spoke to the defense, she admitted that police had pressured her to lie. On top of that, the full interrogation footage clearly showed just how far the detectives had gone, well past the line of what was legal or ethical. Eventually, they filed an appeal, and in 2017, 19 years after Christopher was convicted, a judge officially dropped the charges related to the sexual assault, citing the fact that his DNA didn't match the sample found at the scene. That decision gave him the right to walk free, though the murder conviction still technically remained on his record. When the judge read out the ruling and Christopher was declared a free man, Angie's mother stood up, wrapped her arms around him, and walked out of the courtroom by his side, holding his hand. But this wasn't the end, just the beginning. Since the law still labeled Christopher a murderer, both he and Angie's mother were determined to clear his name completely. By that point, nearly all of the original investigators had retired, and the department had a new lead detective, one who was also committed to finally uncovering the truth. Working alongside Christopher and Angie's mother, the new lead detective kept digging into the case, with all hopes now resting on DNA. By this time, forensic technology had come a long way, and they still had several samples from the crime scene in storage. But their first renewed attempt didn't lead anywhere. Experts analyzed the evidence and ran the profiles through national databases, but nothing came up. Then, in 2018, they turned to Paraben Nanolabs, a company that specialized in genetic genealogy. This method uses publicly shared DNA data from genealogy websites, where millions of people upload their genetic profiles to learn about their ancestry or find relatives. With enough matches, experts can start tracing a suspect's family tree, even from distant relatives, and eventually narrow it down to the person they're looking for. Eventually, they landed on an elderly couple who had 6 male descendants, all of whom had lived in Idaho around the time of Angie's murder. Police tracked each one down and tested their DNA, but none of them were a match. Still, the detectives weren't ready to give up. They kept digging deeper into the family tree and eventually landed on one man who seemed like a promising lead. Investigators began looking into his background, and word quickly spread that he was a suspect in a decades-old murder. His life was turned upside down, but when his DNA was tested, the results proved he wasn't the killer. 3 months later, detectives made another discovery. There was one more man from that same family who hadn't been considered yet. A man named Brian Drips. He was a former soldier and the father of 3 kids. The reason he'd been missed was pretty simple. He was adopted as a child and had grown up under a different last name. This time, police moved carefully. They didn't want to repeat the mistake of falsely implicating someone and ruining their life. So, they put Drips under surveillance, waited until he tossed a cigarette butt out his car window, then collected it and sent it to the lab. When the results came back, detectives finally had a match. After more than 2 decades, they'd found their man. As the investigation moved forward, detectives learned that at the time of Angie's murder, Brian Drips had actually lived right across the street from her. Police had even spoken to him during the original investigation, but for some reason, he was never treated as a suspect. They also found out that his ex-wife had left him because of his extensive drug use. Now armed with a DNA match, police arrested Brian and brought him in for questioning. For nearly 5 hours, he denied any involvement, But once detectives revealed the DNA evidence, everything changed. Brian went silent, and a few minutes later, he asked to step outside for a smoke. When he came back, he sat quietly for a moment and then said, "I did it." According to Brian, he'd been drunk and high the night Angie was killed. He claimed his memory of that night was hazy, but he did recall sexually assaulting her. The rest, he said, was a blur. After his confession, Brian Drips was officially charged with Angie's murder. And after more than 2 decades, Christopher was finally cleared once and for all. The trial of Brian Drips didn't begin until February 2021, several years after his arrest. In court, he didn't take back his confession. He repeated everything he told the detectives. As part of his defense, Brian claimed he hadn't meant to kill Angie. He said he only intended to sexually assault her. In the end, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. And just like that, Angie's case was finally solved. But this story didn't end with the conviction of the real killer. After his release, Christopher struggled to return to anything resembling a normal life. He spoke openly about how prison had broken him and how after spending so many years behind bars, he had no idea what to do with his freedom. Adjusting to life on the outside wasn't easy, but eventually, he found a job, made new friends, and even got married. Christopher also pushed for a law that would guarantee compensation for the wrongfully convicted. Thanks to his efforts, the state passed it, and he received around $1 million. He also filed lawsuits against the detectives who had coerced his false confession, and the court awarded him an additional $11.4 million in damages. It seemed like his life was finally starting to turn around. But in 2023, everything changed. Earlier that year, he and his wife filed for divorce, and not long after, she died in a car crash. 2 months later, Christopher got into an argument with a professional wrestler at a hotel party. The man attacked him, and during the fight, Christopher hit his head on the table. He died a few hours later in the hospital. Police arrested the wrestler and discovered that he had a long history of violent behavior. He'd been involved in several serious altercations before. This time, he was charged with homicide, and now he could be facing a long prison sentence of his own. Even though Angie's case was finally solved, the road to justice came at a devastating cost. Police had destroyed the life of an innocent man. And just 6 years after he was released from prison, Christopher was dead. It's also important to remember that this case might have remained unsolved if it weren't for Angie's mother. She spent over 20 years fighting for the truth, refusing to give up no matter how many obstacles stood in her way. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.